Welcome! This is part 2, our second video in our 5-part video series that tells the fascinating story of how the United States ended up acquiring all of its vast territory that now comprises the continental United States. So in part 1, we saw how Spain kicked it all off when they sent Christopher Columbus across the Atlantic Ocean and he discovered America. And from there, the Spanish started colonizing the place. So the Spanish went into Mexico, up through Mexico, and into territory that is now the United States. And we were astonished to see just how much territory the Spanish actually occupied in what is today the United States. So let's pick up the story there and let's jump right into part 2. Spain's a busy little bee here colonizing the New World, but they weren't the only ones. In fact, they kicked it off. They kicked off a whole era of exploration that lasted for centuries. It's referred to as the Age of Discovery. So once Christopher Columbus made his voyage, that proved that the Atlantic Ocean could be crossed, and in fact that there's a new world on the other side. So all these other European countries said, you know what, if Spain can do it, then we can do it too. So this kicked off a whole era of all these other European countries getting down on this. Now, they were looking for a couple things. One thing they were looking for is they still wanted to get to China by sea. Remember, that was the whole purpose of why Christopher Columbus did his voyage in the first place. He was trying to get to China. Even though Christopher Columbus discovered that this landmass was in the way to get to China, these Western European countries still desired to find a sea passage to China. So the game now became, okay, well, what we need to do is we need to find a waterway passage through this land. That became known as the Northwest Passage. And it could either be a stream or a river that ran through the land, or someplace where the ocean went all the way through. But the idea was if they could find a waterway passage through this land, that would take them to the Pacific Ocean, and from the Pacific Ocean, they could then get to China. In addition to trying to find the Northwest Passage through America to China, these European countries also had their eye on colonizing the New World. And this is because they're watching Spain hauling back all this gold and silver and treasure from the New World, and these other countries are saying, hey, I want to get down on that too. So there are really 3 major players here, 3 other countries that affected the territory that is now continental United States, in addition to Spain. So in addition to Spain, you had number 1, France, number 2, the Netherlands or the Dutch, and number 3, England. So let's check out France. Let's see what France was up to. So in 1524, which is, about 30 years after Columbus's initial voyage, France sends this guy over, this guy Giovanni Verrazzano. Now you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, that's an Italian name, and you're right, he was Italian, but don't get confused because he was actually sailing for France. So France sends Verrazzano over to the New World, and his mission was to discover the Northwest Passage to China. Verrazzano sets sail from France, he crosses the Atlantic Ocean, and he comes to what is now the eastern coast of the United States. Verrazzano's strategy for finding this Northwest Passage, remember this Northwest Passage is some river or a waterway that will cut all the way across this land and get to the Pacific Ocean so you can then get to China. So his strategy for finding this Northwest Passage is he's going to start down here and he's going to sail north and he's going to hug the coastline and he's going to look for on the coastline for some inlet or some waterway or the mouth of some river that looks like the waterway goes this way, and then he'll go this way and see if it goes all the way across the land. So in something that is funny today, although it's also just an amazing twist of history, is as Verrazzano is sailing northward along the coast, he encounters New York, which is today what is now New York. And New York, this is the New York City area. In fact, he was the first European to see New York. This is a closer shot of the New York Harbor area. So Verrazano's sailing up from the ocean. He sees this area here that looks like an inlet, and he says to himself, hey, this might get me to China, so let me go in here. So he takes a left here and he comes into this area. He sails through the Narrows, which is, it's narrows because you can see the water becomes narrow because these two land areas jut out. So this is today, this is Staten Island, this is Brooklyn. He sails into the Narrows and he sails into New York Bay here. He was the first European to come into New York Bay. He sees New Jersey over here, Brooklyn here, and he sees Manhattan Island right here. This is Manhattan. And here is the Hudson River. So it wasn't called the Hudson River then, but he sees this river and he looks up this river and he says, you know what? This doesn't look big enough. This doesn't look deep enough. I don't think this is going to get me to China. So he turns around and he leaves. He sails back through the Narrows, back to the ocean, and then he continues on his journey along the coast of the United States. This is one of the greatest misses in history. I mean, this is the first European to come into New York, and he sees Manhattan and what would become New York City, and he could have claimed it for France. But instead, what does he do? He goes, nah, I'm not interested. And he turns around and sails away. That is a whiff. I mean, we all make mistakes, but that was a pretty big one. So poor Verrazano. But things didn't turn out all that badly for him because he is remembered and honored through his name. Right at the Narrows here, where Verrazano sailed, they built a magnificent bridge which connected Staten Island to Brooklyn, and they named that bridge after Verrazano. It is now named the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and it is referred to as the Verrazano Bridge. And when it was built in 1964, it was the largest suspension bridge in the world, and it's still the largest suspension bridge in the Americas. It's even longer than the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco by about 60 feet. This is a good shot of it here. Here is the Verrazano Bridge, and this shows what Verrazano would have seen back in 1524 when he was the first European to sail into this area. So he sailed from the Atlantic into the Narrows, underneath the bridge, although the bridge wasn't there, into the mouth of the New York Harbor right here. So here's New York Harbor. This is Manhattan. You can see the tall buildings, New York City right here. And right around here is the Statue of Liberty. So Verrazano would have sailed right into here. He would have seen all this and he would have said, no thanks. But at least he got his name on the bridge. Verrazano didn't end up kicking off the colonization in the New World for France. So 10 years later, France tries again. In 1534, France sends over another guy by the name of Jacques Cartier. And Cartier has a different strategy for his exploration, and he ends up in a location that would later become France's sort of home base for France's efforts at colonizing the New World. Jacques Cartier set sail from France in 1534 over to the New World. Now, for comparative purposes, remember Spain, when Spain came to the New World previously, 1492 Columbus, they came this way and headed sort of in a southerly direction and ended up down here in the south. And then they colonized this way into Mexico, and they came into the United States up through Mexico and came into the United States this way. So France here with Jacques Cartier in 1534, they stay up here to the north and they come in over here, up here in the northern area, which is now Canada. And the reason was Jacques Cartier was interested in exploring the St. Lawrence River, the Great St. Lawrence River. And again, he was looking for the Northwest Passage to China. Again, looking for a waterway that went all the way through this land to the Pacific Ocean so they could get to China. And Cartier thought this area, the St. Lawrence, looked pretty promising for that. And indeed, you can understand why. Because this is a huge area. It's a huge body of water, a huge inlet, and it's going in the right direction. It seems to be heading west. So it seems like, you know what, maybe that does go all the way through. So Cartier comes into this area here. This is a closer look of it. So here's the Gulf of St. Lawrence where Cartier comes in, actually stops right here on this peninsula, and he plants the flag for France. Ta-da! France is here. France owns all of this land now. So this map shows Canada up here and the United States down here. This red line reflects the current boundaries, today's boundaries between Canada and the United States. So here you can see Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire and New York. So Cartier comes in here, plants the flag for French, and starts some settlements. But France was slow to settle this area. It took them a long time. So it wasn't until much later, like 75 years later, that France made another push to really kind of get these settlements going. So they sail further down the St. Lawrence and they establish one of their main cities. Actually, the St. Lawrence was a critically important mode of travel. Travel here in this area was conducted through these rivers. It was through the waterways that travel. That's how they'd get all the people in and the goods in. It was all dependent upon these rivers. So the French moved down the St. Lawrence River and they established the city Quebec right here. And Quebec is still there today. It's a huge city in Canada. So that was in 1608, so roughly 75 years after Cartier first sailed in. So France continues their settlement here by pushing down the St. Lawrence even further, and then they established a city here at Montreal. So you've got Quebec and Montreal, and this area sort of serves as France's sort of home base of their efforts in colonizing the New World. So again, it takes France a long time to build out these settlements. So another 75 or 80 years later, it's in the late 1600s, at the early 1700s, that France makes another push to grab more territory and settle more territory. So they begin to move this way. They move westward. So here are the Great Lakes. So they move around the Great Lakes this way and through here, and then they start coming down into the United States. They also start coming down into the United States this way through New York and Pennsylvania. So here's another look of it. Again, here's the St. Lawrence Gulf where Cartier sailed in. Here's the St. Lawrence River, Quebec, Montreal. So the French end up going this way, west, and then coming down into the United States this way. They also come down a little bit this way as well. So the French end up bumping into the Mississippi River, and they start exploring down the Mississippi River. In fact, one French explorer was hoping that the Mississippi River would be the key to the Northwest Passage, that it would turn west and cut across the land and take them to the Pacific Ocean. But when he found out from the locals that now the river, in fact, goes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico to the south and it does not turn west, he said, forget it, and turned around and went home. But France thought better of it, and they continued their exploration. So they continued to explore down the Mississippi River, establishing forts and settlements all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, where they established a number of cities down here, including New Orleans, which New Orleans is a major city today. So as France was exploring this area and coming down the Mississippi River and coming down this way to the Ohio River, which flows into the Mississippi River, France established all this territory for themselves. And at the time, the King of France was King Louis XIV. So as a result, in honor of their king, they named this territory Louisiana, after King Louis, Louisiana. So this map shows the extent of the French Empire in the Americas, which is depicted in blue here. So here is the St. Lawrence Gulf, where Cartier sailed in down the St. Lawrence River, Quebec, Montreal, and then the French moved this way and then came into the United States this way down the Mississippi River, establishing New Orleans down here. So this territory is Louisiana, known as the Louisiana Territory. But it is just amazing how much territory France owned in what is today the United States. When the Europeans came into this territory that is now the United States, they weren't the first people to get there. In fact, there were other people who were already there. So who were these other people, and how did they get there? Well, It turns out we all came from the same place, Africa. 200,000 years ago, our species, Homo sapiens, and we're all Homo sapiens, we're all the same, emerged in Africa. Okay? And everything was cool. We hung out in Africa for a while, for about 130,000 years. And then we decided, you know what, let's go check out some other places. So about 70,000 years ago, we decided, let's go this way. So we moved out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula and then into the Middle East. Now, once here, we kind of stood around, looked at each other and said, should we go left or should we go right? And some people said, you know what, I think we're going to hang a left. And that was fine. Other people said, all right, hey, that's cool. You hang a left, we're going to hang a right. So good luck to you guys. We'll catch you later. So the people who ended up hanging a left, they ended up finding their way to Western Europe. And the people who ended up hanging a right found their way to Asia or China. So this took about 30,000 years. So we left Africa around 70,000 years ago, and 30,000 years later, by about 40,000 years ago, Western Europe and Eastern Asia were pretty well populated. So everything's cool, people hang out for another couple of tens of thousands of years, and then the people in Asia here decide, you know what, let's go check out some other places. Actually, the theory is that they followed some migrating big game. So they ended up moving north here, going through Russia and coming up over today it's the Bering Straits. There's water here, but back then it was a land bridge. It was all land. So they came up here, over here into Alaska, down through Canada, and into what is today the United States. So by about 15,000 years ago, the United States is pretty well populated. When these Europeans went to the New World and encountered these people, they shouldn't have started killing them. It should have been more like a family reunion. Hey, what's up? Good to see ya. You know, you look a little different. Yeah, so do you. But you look good. Yeah, so do you. Right? We all came from the same place. We're all the same. We're all human beings living on the same planet. There's no reason we should be killing each other. The people who ended up hanging a left when they came out of Africa and going to Western Europe ended up forming their own nations like Spain and France and England. And the people who ended up hanging a right and coming over to what is now the United States ended up forming their nations and tribes. So this map shows some of them. So here in the Great Plains area, you had the Crow, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Pawnee. In the Southwest area, you had the Navajo, the Apache, the Comanches. In Florida, you had the Seminoles. In the sort of Southeast, you had the Cherokees, the Creeks. In the Midwest, you had the Miamis, the Shawnees. And in the Northeast, you had the Lenapes and the Iroquois, and there's a number that aren't on here as well, like the Huron, the Algonquin, the Mohawk, and the Mohicans. These native populations had been on this land for 15,000 years. Now, just to put that in perspective, the United States as a nation is only some 200 years old, and the Europeans discovering America was only 500 years ago. But these native populations had been on this land for over 15,000 years. That is quite a difference. So in some respects, it may not make sense to say that Columbus discovered America, because you can't really discover something if other people already know about it. It's not really a discovery then. So, and there is a movement sort of underway to say that, you know, to try to change the nomenclature, to say that Columbus didn't discover America, but instead, let's say that Columbus encountered America. And this, you know, makes some sense. We'll have to see if it sticks. But from the European perspective, which is very Eurocentric, but from the European perspective, it was a discovery to them because they felt like they understood the whole world. So when Columbus, bumped into this new landmass, that was brand new to them, and it was a discovery. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But there are other people who do not like this notion that Columbus discovered America. And one reason is that Columbus, in fact, may not have been the first European to cross the Atlantic and land in the Americas. There is evidence that suggests that the Vikings did it under Leif Erikson in the year 1000. That would have been 500 years before Columbus's voyage, right? So that's pretty amazing. But I think the reason that didn't stick is because even if it's true, even if the Vikings did cross the Atlantic and land in the Americas, they didn't stay there. They didn't settle it, and they didn't, populate it. So, but that is what the Europeans did under Columbus. They, settled the land and populated the land. But that is certainly an area of great controversy, the way that these Europeans settled the land with respect to how they handled the native populations who were already there. And that is a rich area for further study if you're interested in it. In fact, if you put yourself in the perspective of the native populations who were there, what do? You've got all these Europeans all of a sudden streaming in. What do you do? How do you handle it? What's your strategy? Do you fight them? Do you go to war? Do you try to befriend them? Do you assimilate with them? Or do you try to set up some sort of sharing arrangement where you draw boundaries and say, you stay over there, we'll stay over here? It was a very difficult situation. And there are a number of great leaders of these native populations that you can see were struggling with this very question, and they took different tacks and had different strategies. So it is a rich area for further study if you're interested in that. So now we have both Spain and France occupying huge portions of the United States. But those two countries weren't the only European countries to colonize the United States, and we're going to consider the next one. The next one now is the Netherlands, or the Dutch. Here is the location of the Netherlands in Europe. So it's right next to Germany, right next to Belgium, pretty close to France, and right across the channel from the United Kingdom. So in the early 1600s, the Dutch say, hey, we want to get down on this too. So this was a little over 100 years after Columbus first sailed to America in 1492. So the Dutch set up this private company. It's called the Dutch East India Company. And it's interesting because it was a private company that was set up on a for-profit basis. So investors came, pooled their money, and the purpose was to send these expeditions out to make money. So in 1609, they hire this guy, Henry Hudson. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, that sounds like an English guy. And you're right, he was English, but don't make a mistake, he was sailing for the Netherlands and for the Dutch. So Henry Hudson gets hired by this Dutch company, and the purpose was for Henry Hudson to find the Northwest Passage. Okay, we learned about this previously. So the Northwest Passage, the idea is that it is a waterway. People want to find a waterway through the North American continent to try to get directly to the Pacific Ocean so you can then get to China. So the purpose is to find one sea route from Europe to China. So the question was, does that exist through the North American continent? Is there a waterway, a river, or somewhere where the ocean goes through? So everybody's scrambling around. This went on for centuries, scrambling, trying to find a Northwest Passage. So that's what the Dutch hire Henry Hudson to do. So Henry Hudson gets on his ship, the Half Moon, and off he goes sailing for America. Henry Hudson sails from Europe, from the Netherlands, across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. Now, Henry Hudson has a strategy for finding the Northwest Passage, and that is, he believes that the Northwest Passage lies somewhere between the St. Lawrence Bay up here and the Chesapeake Bay down here. So he wants to explore this area. So he lands up here, he bounces in a couple places, he lands in Cape Cod, he keeps sailing down, and he turns around, and his strategy is to sail north along the coast, hugging the coast, all along the coast, looking for some mouth of a river or some body of water that looks like it will take him through all the way through the United States to the Pacific Ocean so he can then get to China. Now, if you were watching earlier, you will say to yourself, this sounds very familiar. And you're exactly right, because this is the exact same strategy that another explorer, Giovanni Verrazzano, took when he was sailing for France 85 years earlier. He also hugged this coast. Exact same strategy, looking for the Northwest Passage. So Henry Hudson starts coming up here, hugging the coast, hugging the coast. He sees the Delaware Bay. He says this might be a prospect, so he sails into the Delaware Bay, but pretty quickly realizes that the rivers get too shallow pretty soon. He turns around, sails back, and then continues his voyage up the coast, looking for an inlet. And Henry Hudson, just like Verrazzano 85 years earlier, comes across the New York area, which is now New York City. So Henry Hudson, just like Verrazzano, spots this inlet here, this bay in the New York City area. So they're coming up to the Atlantic Ocean, they spot this bay, and they decide to come in and check it out. So both Verrazzano and 85 years later, Henry Hudson sail in through these narrows. So today, this is Staten Island and Brooklyn, and they ended up building a bridge here connecting Staten Island and Brooklyn, which today is named the Verrazzano Bridge, after Verrazzano, who was the first European to sail through these narrows. So both Verrazzano and Henry Hudson sailed into the New York Bay right here. So this is Manhattan, this is Brooklyn, this is New Jersey. And this is what the Bay Area looks like today. So this is the Verrazzano Bridge connecting Brooklyn on this side, and then this side leads to Staten Island. And both Verrazzano and Henry Hudson would have sailed up from the Atlantic into these narrows underneath the bridge, although the bridge wasn't there at that time, in through the narrows here and into the mouth of New York Harbor. And this is the view that they would have seen. So this is Manhattan Island. You can see all these large buildings are Manhattan. That's the southern tip of Manhattan. And this is the Hudson River. So they both would have had this same spectacular view. And Verrazzano, 85 years earlier, took a look around and said, nothing special, I'm not interested. And he turned his ship around and sailed away. And that was it for Verrazzano, never to be heard from again. Henry Hudson, on the other hand, he said this is a spectacular area. You have to wonder if he envisioned anything that it is like now. So he says this area is great for settlement, and he looks at this river and says, you know what, this river, maybe this river is the passage to China. So he decides to sail up this river. And he was the first European to sail up the river, and that is why the river is now called the Hudson River, after Henry Hudson. So this is the New York Bay where they both were. Verrazzano exited quickly, but Henry Hudson decides to explore and sail up the Hudson River. So this is the island of Manhattan. The Hudson River runs up the western portion of Manhattan and runs up into upstate New York. And one of the amazing things about this expedition was that there was an officer on Henry Hudson's ship by the name of Robert Jewett, and Robert Jewett kept a log of their travels. So he has this great description of what it was like coming into New York Harbor, sailing up the Hudson River, and their interaction with natives. And he describes how they were on the Europeans were on their ship, the Half Moon, and these natives were paddling canoes out, and they were engaging in trading goods, and everything was all good, although there were some episodes of violence and some people did end up dying. But overall, the Europeans had a very favorable disposition of the Indians in the area. So Henry Hudson continues traveling north along the Hudson River on his exploration. And this is a larger shot of the area. So down here is the New York Bay, and Manhattan's down here, although you can't really make it out because it's too small. This is Long Island here. This is Staten Island. And then Henry Hudson sailed up the Hudson River, past what today is Kingston, all the way up to Albany. So Albany is today the capital of New York. And this is about 150 miles between New York City and Albany. Once he hit Albany, Henry Hudson realized that this probably is not the Northwest Passage because the river is becoming too shallow, and that was as far as his expedition went. Henry Hudson sails back to the Netherlands, reports back to his investors and says, hey, I found this great location for a settlement. Unfortunately, I didn't find a passage to China, but I did find this great location for a settlement. So the investors are thrilled, and they're like, great, all right, we're going to send some more people over and settle this area. One thing about Henry Hudson, so he becomes famous from this expedition, right? So he, the Hudson River is named after him. He gets the Hudson Bay named after him. Hudson, New York is named after him. So he's a famous explorer. But prior to that, he had some pretty big failures. So previously, he was looking for this passage to China, but he decided to take another route. He decided to go from Europe, sail north and then east from Europe to try to get to China that way. But his expeditions were utter failures. But nonetheless, he still moved ahead. And later, he got hired by the Netherlands to take this expedition over to the New World, which made him famous. So it's sort of an inspirational moment that, even super successful and famous people have failures as well. We all have failures. But what's important is to, deal with your failures and learn from your failures and keep moving ahead with your dreams in order to achieve success. So it's sort of an inspirational moment there with Henry Hudson. So the Dutch continue to send people to this location that Henry Hudson had founded. About 5 years later, in 1615, they sent a bunch of people over who followed the same route into New York Harbor, up the Hudson River to what's now Albany, and they established this fort at Albany, Fort Orange. And that is to become, what it's intended to become, the headquarters of New Netherlands, right? So this is the country they established, New Netherlands in the New World. All these European countries were doing that. New Spain, New France, New England, right? So this is New Netherlands. So they established this fort, they start trading and all that. But a little while later, they kind of realized, now that they knew the area better, they said to themselves, there seems to be a better location, a pretty good location on this big island of Manhattan, down at the southern tip of Manhattan. That seems to be a pretty good location. It's right in the harbor, it's right where the rivers are. So they decide to build an outpost there. So they build a fort on the southern tip of Manhattan in 1624. So this location turns out to be a great location, very successful, good location. The trade is going well, all of that. So a couple years later, the guy who's the head of it all for the Netherlands, this guy named Peter Minuit, he decides to try to buy this land from the Indians. So in a transaction that is now famous in history, Peter Minuit goes to the Lenape Indians and he negotiates a deal to buy Manhattan from the Indians for some beads and some trinkets that are valued at $24. Okay, so only $24 to buy the entire island of Manhattan. Now, some versions of history kind of stop right there and say this is a great transaction, what a wonderful thing, and all of that, and the greatest real estate deal in history, and all that. But if you think about it, something doesn't quite seem right that it all went down like that. It's just such a uneven transaction that it doesn't quite seem right. And in fact, it doesn't really reflect well on Peter Minuit either. It wasn't really this great transaction. What it was really was a ripoff, right? So what kind of person would do that to another person? And then when the other person complained, so the Indians later said, wait a minute, this is not what we thought we agreed to. The Dutch enforced this agreement by saying, no, you took the $24, so because you took the $24, we get to keep Manhattan. It doesn't quite seem right. It was an unconscionable transaction which would never be enforced in courts today. So the historians have offered another perspective on this as well, which is that really the Indians did not have a concept of the private ownership of property. That was just such a foreign concept to them. To them, mankind doesn't own nature. Birds don't own the trees. People don't own the sky or the clouds, and the people don't own property. So to them, what did the Indians think they were agreeing to? Well, what they were likely thought they were agreeing to was to share it. Right, to not kill each other when you saw each other on the property. So okay, we'll share this, and that's what they did with their other people in the area. Is they share the tribe. Nobody owns it. So later, when the Dutch said to the Indians, "You are not allowed to set foot on this island because now we own it," the Indians were like, "What are you talking about?" And we certainly never would have agreed to that. We never would have agreed that we can't come on the land anymore. So, and particularly not for $24. So that seems to be a more reasonable explanation of what happened. So, but the Dutch, they continued their relations with the Indians. Actually, they had pretty good relations, although it was up and down. You know, it was good and bad. They were certainly forming alliances and trading with the Indians and all that. But they also had skirmishes, and there were raids both ways, and you know there were deaths on both sides. So, but the Dutch continue to build out this area here on the southern tip of Manhattan. So they built the fort, and then they start building a community outside of the fort. This is a view of the Dutch colony on the southern tip of Manhattan. So this is the southern tip of Manhattan, although it's a little confusing because it's sideways. North is actually this way to the right. But here is Fort Amsterdam that they built in 1624. And then they began to sort of build out their community beyond the fort. So a couple of windmills out here, and they established a church and a blacksmith and some businesses, and there's some residential homes where people lived and some farmlands to plant and grow food. So it was a whole community here on the southern tip of Manhattan, and they named this city New Amsterdam, again after the great city Amsterdam in the Netherlands. An amazing thing about this community is that it was culturally diverse right from the start. So even though it was New Netherlands, all of the settlers who were living there weren't necessarily from Dutch background. And part of this was due to the fact that in Europe, Netherlands, the country Netherlands, was also diverse because they were accepting in people from other countries who were being persecuted or what have you. So the Netherlands had a diverse population. So when people came from the Netherlands to New Amsterdam, they weren't necessarily all from Dutch background. But also New Amsterdam was accepting people in from other places as well. So you had a community here of people with diverse backgrounds. Another aspect was that these people were permitted to practice their own religions. So you had a sense of religious freedom here, which was pretty amazing and somewhat enlightened, particularly for the early to mid 1600s, right? So it was a diverse culture. Now, they did have black slaves, so it was by no means perfect. But the form of slavery that they practiced was less egregious here than in some other places. So, for example, the black slaves had rights. So they could marry, for example, that was recognized, and have children. And their families were not split apart for slavery. And the black slaves could enforce their rights in court. So the black slaves could sue people, including suing white people. So the form of slavery wasn't as egregious as in some other places. But the amazing thing about this community is that it was the beginning of what would become New York City. This was the inception of New York City. So it was multicultural and diverse right from the start, and New York City was founded by the Dutch. On this view of the Dutch colony, we can see some indications of what would later become New York City. So if you look at this street, this is a pretty significant street here, and this street became Broadway. And today it is now what is the lower portion of Broadway in Manhattan. Another element is, so the Dutch built a wall around their community here, and this is the northern portion of the wall. And you can see that there is a street that runs right next to this wall. And this became known as Wall Street. And it is Wall Street in Manhattan today. And it's the same Wall Street that is the financial center of the world, the location of the stock market and a bunch of investment banks and financial law firms and the like. So this depicts the early settlement of the Dutch on the southern tip of Manhattan, and this is what it looks like today. Wow. So this is the southern tip of Manhattan. You can see all of these skyscrapers that are now on Wall Street and the financial center of Manhattan. This is another view of the island of Manhattan. So this is the southern tip down here. This is what the Dutch founded here in New Amsterdam. And then as you go north on the island, you can see this is Midtown Manhattan. This rectangle is Central Park in the middle of Manhattan, and then north of Central Park is Harlem. You can also see this is the Brooklyn Bridge. This is Brooklyn over here. This is Queens over here. And this is the Hudson River. This is what started it all. This is when Henry Hudson sailed into this bay. He was the first European to sail up the Hudson River, and he is the one who founded this location for this Dutch colony. And this is a view of Midtown Manhattan looking west. So this is the East River. To the west on the other side of Manhattan is the Hudson River. And you can see the UN, the United Nations building here in New York. So it is amazing to think that this Dutch settlement is what led to the founding of New York City. But New York City wasn't the only area that the Dutch founded. They expanded beyond just Manhattan. So here is a larger map of the area. It's a little bit difficult to see, but this is the island of Manhattan right here. And this large red dot is New Amsterdam. So this is New York City, the southern tip of Manhattan. And this is the larger region showing Dutch settlements. So this portion is Brooklyn, this portion is Queens, and here you have Brooklyn. So the name Brooklyn actually comes from a Dutch settlement. It's the different spelling, but it is Brooklyn. So it is amazing, actually, all of these names that survive today that are actually Dutch names. Many of them you don't realize they're Dutch names, but there are many, many Dutch names in the area. Not only in the New York City area, but also upstate as well along the Hudson River. It's amazing. And in New Jersey. So you can see, for example, Bushwick, Queens, and Flushing, which is now in Queens, Hempstead, Long Island. So this area is Long Island. You can see Long Island in the Dutch spelling. Down here you see Staten Island with the Dutch spelling. And in New Jersey as well. So Hoboken, Bergen, these are all Dutch settlements. And in the northern portion of Manhattan, they established a village, New Harlem. And this is what is Harlem today. So this New York City area in Brooklyn was not the only area that the Dutch settled, but they expanded from here as well. So this is a larger view. So down here is the New York City area, Manhattan. The red square is New Amsterdam, New York City. And you can see Long Island here. And then this goes for many miles down south with a number of Dutch settlements, as well as north up the Hudson River. This is Fort Orange at what today is Albany. So they have settlements along the way here, as well as east into Connecticut. So this view depicts the extent of the Dutch Empire in what is now the United States. And it's pretty significant territory. Actually, the Dutch claimed a much larger territory going this way and this way, but this map depicts really what they consolidated. So we're going with this map. So here is the New York City area, and this is Long Island. So in addition to Brooklyn and Queens, they also established settlements on a portion of Long Island. And then this is New Jersey, all the way down to the Delaware Bay here. They owned part of Delaware, part of Maryland, part of Pennsylvania, part of New York, all along the Hudson River here on both east and west sides, and part of Connecticut. So as you can see, it is amazing that the Dutch Empire owned a significant portion of what is now the United States. Thus far, we've seen 3 of these European empires who have come over and occupied a whole bunch of territory in what now is the United States. So we've seen Spain, France, and the Netherlands. Now we're going to consider the last one on our list. Last, but by no means least, England. So England decides to get into the game too and do a little colonizing here. So England actually started out very early, although it didn't last. So Columbus's initial voyage for Spain was in 1492. And it was only 5 years after that that England said, we've got to do this too. So they sent an expedition over in only 1497 by this guy named John Cabot. So this is the route of Christopher Columbus from Spain in 1492. And it was only 5 years later, England said, hey, we got to get out on this too. So England sent this guy, John Cabot, on an expedition in 1497. So Cabot landed in Newfoundland, which is today Canada, and he returned. He did not establish any settlements. Incidentally, Cabot also mistakenly believed that he had been in Asia, just like Christopher Columbus's mistaken belief. The very next year, he said, I want to sail back. So he had another expedition the very next year. But that expedition was lost at sea, and he was never heard from again. So England at that point pretty much stopped sending expeditions for a while. It wasn't for almost another 100 years before England got back into the game here of trying to colonize America. So this was in the late 1500s under the rule of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, she was actually a fascinating character in history, and I would encourage you to take a look into her life. She had amazing circumstances and amazing life. So she decides to get back into this game of colonization. So the way she starts, though, she doesn't just send an expedition over to the New World. She starts by engaging in privateering on Spanish ships. So this concept of privateering is just amazing to me. So what it was you'd have a state, a legitimate state here, England, and the state would authorize private citizens or private companies to go ahead and attack other people's ships. Here, Spanish ships. And you could keep the profits. That was the whole thing. So the country didn't pay you, but you could keep the profits. So they are authorizing private citizens, with cannons, guns, whatever. You could go and kill people, blow up their ships, whatever, and take all their stuff, and you can keep everything that you take, although you had to give a kickback back to the crown. Right, so I mean, it's just an amazing practice. That practice is no longer permitted. It's been outlawed by international treaty, but it was a common practice for a long period of time, and all these countries engaged in it, including the United States. It was like thought to be this legitimate practice. But it's just amazing to think of today. So that's what Queen Elizabeth does. She gets in by starting to authorize these privateers to they're basically pirates. That's what it is. It's like state-sanctioned piracy is what it is. So that's how she starts, and the reason that she does it is because her enemy, Spain, was way ahead of this game. They've been in this colonization game for almost 100 years now, and so Queen Elizabeth is watching all these Spanish ships returning from the New World, laden with gold and silver and treasure. So her idea is, instead of having to establish colonies ourselves, let's just grab these Spanish ships and grab the treasure. That way we can get the treasure without doing the hard work. Pretty amazing. So, but she does decide that, we also have to get into the game of colonization. So she ends up sending some expeditions over. And there was one expedition she sent in 1584, and this was her and Walter Raleigh. Now, Raleigh didn't go on this expedition, actually. He'd been on others in like South America, but he didn't go on this one. But he planned it and organized it and arranged it along with and for Queen Elizabeth. So the expedition crosses the Atlantic Ocean in 1584 and lands in the outer islands of what is today North Carolina. And they plant the flag for England, and they claim this some vast territory for England, and they name it Virginia, and they name it for the Queen. Now, you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, it's Queen Elizabeth. Her name was Elizabeth, not Virginia. How did that happen? And so what the story was that Queen Elizabeth had never married, and she never had any children. So she became known as the Virgin Queen. So the name of this territory was named Virginia after the Virgin Queen. Now, and this name comes down to us today. It is that is the history of the name of this current state of Virginia. Although when they planted the flag, the territory is much larger than the state of Virginia. So this name may have been given by either the Queen herself or by Walter Raleigh or by Raleigh and the Queen working together, which kind of suggests, something about their relationship. So they did have a relationship, some sort of a relationship, and it is thought that the Queen was in love with Sir Walter Raleigh. This was actually depicted in a recent movie, where Queen Elizabeth was played by Cate Blanchett and Walter Raleigh was played by Clive Owen. It was called Elizabeth: The Golden Age. It was a pretty good movie. Actually, there were two movies. There was part 1 and part 2. The Golden Age was part 2 that covered this topic, and then the previous one was part 1. They were both pretty good. So the expedition goes to, they land on this island in North Carolina, and they name this island Roanoke Island. And this became known as the Roanoke Colony. So they build a little fort there, and they try to make a go of things. So later on, there was a ship that was supposed to give supplies to Roanoke Colony so it could survive, but the ship was long delayed. So by the time it actually arrived at the Roanoke Colony, what did they find? The Roanoke Colony was abandoned. There was nobody there. And nobody knows, to this day, nobody knows what happened to those people. Now, there's a few theories. Some theories are, well, they got on ships and tried to sail back to England and were lost at sea. Some say that they were murdered by the Native Americans that were located there, but there was no evidence of any sort of a massacre. And some say that the colony integrated into the local Native American population, and some say that some of these local tribes had children that were sort of semi-Caucasian. But nobody knows for sure, and it became known as the Lost Colony. So that was Sir Walter Raleigh's attempt at it, although he is not lost to history, because the city of Raleigh, North Carolina is named after Sir Walter Raleigh. So Queen Elizabeth ends up dying, and she is succeeded by King James I of England. So King James continues this, effort to colonize the New World, although it took him a few years too. So the main expedition that finally got a toehold was in 1607, and this expedition established Jamestown. So it was named Jamestown after King James. So Jamestown was in 1607, and it was in fact England's first permanent settlement in America. So this is the location of Jamestown in what is today the state of Virginia. And Jamestown is what really kicked off England's colonization of America. Jamestown and Williamsburg, colonial Williamsburg, are essentially located in the exact same place. So here is the Chesapeake. This is Delaware and Maryland and Virginia. And here is Washington, D.C. So the English settlers would have crossed the Atlantic Ocean, sailed into the mouth of the Chesapeake, sailed up the James River to found Jamestown. Now, Williamsburg came along later, but Williamsburg is the popular place today, and that is because Williamsburg has been restored, actually a meticulous restoration. It was the pet project of John D. Rockefeller Jr. So the restoration of Williamsburg comes to us courtesy of the Rockefeller fortune. So the story between Jamestown and Williamsburg was that it was Jamestown that was the initial colony in 1607. But several decades later, almost 100 years later, they kind of figured out, you know what, this land just right up here, this is the better land. It's on higher ground, it's just a better land for the colony. So they ended up relocating the capital from Jamestown to Williamsburg, and that was in 1699. Now, after that relocation, they basically abandoned Jamestown. So they let Jamestown sort of just decay and decline. So there are no buildings there today in Jamestown, although you can still go to the site. So you can see the site, and there's an archaeological site where they've excavated some of the foundations of some of the buildings that used to be there at Jamestown, but there are no buildings there today. And that's why Williamsburg is really the main tourist site and destination, because of all the buildings there that have been meticulously restored, with the idea was to recreate what life was like in this early English settlement. But nonetheless, it was Jamestown that was the original colony in 1607. It has been said that the founding of Jamestown represented not only the England coming to America, but also Jamestown and Virginia represented the founding of the entire British Empire. So remember, at this point in time, England hadn't really colonized any countries around the world. It was just England over there, and in their own territory. It was Spain. Spain was the country in Europe who had been colonizing. They'd been at this game for over 100 years now. Right? Columbus was in 1492, but this was 1607 that Jamestown came in. That was over 100 years later. So Spain had been busy colonizing, and so the Spanish Empire had grown to be the largest empire in the world at this time. So British did not have an empire. So their founding here of Jamestown represented not only England coming into the United States to establish a colony, but also it's been said, the inception of the British Empire. Now, the British Empire later grew to become an enormous empire. In fact, the British Empire ended up eclipsing the Spanish Empire, and the British Empire became the largest empire in world history at its peak. But that's not what it was here in 1607. 1607, it was just starting out here with Jamestown. And establishing this colony in Jamestown was extremely difficult. And it was not only Jamestown, it was all these colonies. In fact, in all these countries, Spain, France, the Netherlands, anytime these people were establishing colonies, it was extremely difficult. So many of these colonies did not survive. They were wiped out, and some in a very short period of time. And so many people died trying to establish these colonies. It was just amazing. So Jamestown was no different. In fact, Jamestown came very close to being wiped out itself. In some of its more difficult years, the mortality rate at Jamestown was 80%. So 80% of the people would die. So for every 100 people that was sent over to Jamestown, 80 of them would die. Only 20 of them would survive. I mean, it's harrowing, right? So there were a number of reasons for this. Although you think about it, I mean, just the idea of coming over from a country, crossing this Atlantic Ocean, this huge ocean, coming over to this new land and trying to establish a town in the middle of the woods was extremely difficult, right? So there were a number of reasons why so many people died. One was disease. Right, so they didn't have hospitals and all the the medical care that they had back in Europe. I mean, they're in the middle of the woods here. So one was disease. Another was being killed in battle. So there were a number of battles and attacks and conflicts. Some were with the Native American population, and some were with other competing colonies who were fighting each other. Another was food. Right, you had to grow your own food here, and this was a new land, and if your crops failed, you were in trouble. And surviving the winter was extremely difficult because you had to have enough food and water in order to make it through the winter. So there were a number of reasons why these people would die in all of these colonies. Jamestown was no exception. So why would people want to come over then to the New World? Why would people, come from Europe to the New World? And it's a good question. I mean, there were a number of reasons. One of the things that happened was these European countries instituted all these programs to try to encourage people to go over to the New World because they were trying to populate this new territory. So, but some people came over because whatever their circumstances were before were extremely difficult. Like they might have been under, extremely troubling circumstances in the old world, so the prospect of going to someplace new seemed attractive. Plus, it's being pitched to them as this great land of opportunity, and you can go to this new world and start a new life for yourself and all that. For most people, it didn't work out that way. Some people became wealthy and powerful, but a lot of people had a very difficult time. But some of these programs that these European countries implemented were pretty interesting. So one thing they did was they would give these land grants. So the Netherlands was big on this. Their system was called the patroon system. So if you got one of these land grants, you were the patroon. And some of these land grants were enormous, like 150,000 acres. It's these huge tracts of land. And not only did they give you land, but they also gave you powers. So you had the power to appoint, hire, and fire your sort of regional governors and officials, whoever you wanted, whenever you wanted. You had the power to set up your own justice system and your court system and appoint your own judges and all that. So it was almost like you could be like a little mini king here in your little mini kingdom. So that was an incentive for people to come over and do that. Now these countries put conditions on those land grants. Like what they wanted was a bunch of people to go over to the New World. So the conditions were, all right, we're going to give you this new land, but you've got to bring a bunch of people over and you've got to establish a colony and colonize it under the flag of the home country. So they would put a time limit on it. Like, we'll give you 4 years. And at the end of 4 years, you have to have at least 50 families settled on this land and working this land. So, and if you don't have that, then we're going to take that land away from you and give it to somebody else who will colonize it. So what would happen on this land is it was like a feudal system. So these patroons, you were like the feudal lord. So you would get this land, and then you would encourage people to come over, and you would give these people a smaller plot of land that they would work as sort of tenant farmers, and then they could keep a percentage of what they grew. But of course, you as the feudal lord would get a larger percentage. So this encouraged people from all up and down the hierarchy to go over. It certainly encouraged senior people, like the patroon guy, got all this land, he got to be king, but then he could then encourage his friends to come over. Hey, I'll make you governor of this region and governor of that region, and I'll appoint you judge and all that. So these people thought they had opportunities coming over. And then for the less well-off people, they still had an opportunity because they were being offered, hey, we'll give you your own plot of land that you can work for yourself, and you get to keep a part of that. So that was part of this system of what some of these countries created for encouraging these settlers to go over to this new land. So, but there were other things as well, like some of the colonists in other systems were given more land based upon how many indentured servants they were able to bring over to the colony. So that was another thing. So the game here was the European countries were trying to get people over there. It was the population, increasing the population. That was the name of the game, because the more people you had in this territory, the better chance you would have at colonizing that territory and being able to bring it within your empire. Because with the more people, you could defend it and you could own it. But if you didn't have very many people, that territory was at risk. So that was the name of the game, is trying to get people over. So this idea of a colonist, for every indentured servant they would bring over, they would get a little bit more land. You could see that was an incentive for two reasons. Number one is bringing more people over, so you get more population, but it was also consolidating your territory, more population in your territory, enlarging your territory. So another thing that France did, which is pretty funny, is France had a hard time colonizing their area for a long time. It took them a long time to colonize. They never really consolidated it. But one of the things they did was they sent over shiploads of single women. This was under King Louis XIV. So these women were dubbed the king's daughters, right? So the idea there was, if you were a single man in France and you're thinking about maybe going over to the New World, one of your concerns might be, well, what am I going to do for women? So now that I know that France is going to be shipping over, boatloads of single women, this might be an incentive for me. And also it was, it sort of laid a future where you could find a wife and establish a family over there. There would be women to do that with. So it was, kind of funny. So another factor in having these people come over was religion, actually, and this was, it was varying degrees of importance depending upon the country and the time and the region, but it was an important factor for England. So there was a number of stuff going on in England about religion, Catholicism versus Protestantism and all of that. So there were people who felt persecuted for religious reasons, that they couldn't practice their own religion in the old country. So they were given the opportunity, well, if you come to the New World, you can practice whatever religion you want. So this was a powerful factor for a number of people. So for example, Plymouth was one example of that. Plymouth was the Puritans. So these people came over from Plymouth, England. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed in Massachusetts and established Plymouth, Massachusetts. So this is like a famous story in U.S. history. So they landed at this rock that they called the Plymouth Rock, and it was they were the Puritans. They became known as the Pilgrims, and they came over on this ship named the Mayflower. And this is a famous voyage and famous ship. Some people think it was the first ship, but it wasn't. Jamestown was in 1607, and the Mayflower was in 1620. So it was like 13 years later. But still, it was one of the early founding colonies in the New World. But that was the motivating principle for them, was being able to practice their puritanical religion. And there were other areas as well. So Maryland was established as a haven for Roman Catholics, and Rhode Island it sort of billed itself as free for all, that they would accept any religion. So whatever your religion is, doesn't matter, come on in, you're welcome in Rhode Island. And Connecticut was established as a haven for Congregationalists. So the freedom of religion was a significant factor for some of these people coming over to the New World. Also, interestingly, this actually served as the basis. This is the background for when finally the United States was created. One of the founding principles in the creation of the United States is freedom of religion. And this was one of the reasons why. So it wasn't just the founding fathers sitting in a room going, you know what, maybe this might be a good idea at some point in the future to have people, freedom of religion. No. These people had been in this land for over 150 years, right? Jamestown was founded in 1607. The United States declared independence in 1776. That's 170 years later, right? So these people were coming in all along. These people had been in this country for 150 years, and one of the reasons that they came was to practice their own religion. So when it came time in 1776 to form the United States, these people were concerned. Wait a minute, if we're going to create a new government, how do I know that government's not just going to come in and stamp out my own religion, just like what happened in the old country? So what they were saying was, the only reason I'm going to vote yes for a new government here is if I get assurances that this government will allow me to continue practicing my own religion. So this was the background and the seeds for the fundamental principle when the United States was created of freedom of religion. So England is bringing all these people over to their colonies here, and they're actually pretty successful in establishing their colonies along the East Coast. We see here the British territories. They begin to sort of grow out their colonies. So Jamestown was founded here, and then they began colonizing sort of up and down the coast from Jamestown. Now they also began colonizing up in Canada and in the Caribbean, but this is the English colonies in the United States. Now these colonies grew into the 13 colonies. And this is a map of the 13 colonies. Now, this map may look a little funny initially. It still is the United States here. Here's the eastern coast of the United States. The reason it looks funny is because it just gets cut off right here. It just ends right here. But in fact, the United States territory continues that way. You just can't see it. But you can recognize the East Coast here. So up here is what became Maine, and Massachusetts you have here. Here's the hook of Massachusetts, Cape Cod, and Long Island, and New York here, and the Chesapeake here, down the East Coast here. So these were the 13 colonies, the famous 13 colonies that the Britons developed. So this is Massachusetts. Later, part of it became Maine. Massachusetts, got New Hampshire, New York here, Pennsylvania. And this one cracks me up. So Virginia is enormous. This was Virginia. This was the main territory that they claimed for Queen Elizabeth and their foothold of the British Empire here, the beginning of the British Empire. So this territory is enormous. It goes all the way up into Canada, all the way through here. So this is what they claimed was owned by Virginia. Pretty funny. And then you see North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia here. Now, this was a little bit later because you can see this territory goes all the way over to the Mississippi River. This is huge territory. These colonies didn't start out that way. They started out smaller colonies along the coast here, but as Britain acquired more and more territory, they expanded them westward to the boundary of the Mississippi River. And then the southern boundary was of Florida. So this boundary here is between Georgia and Florida down below. You can't see Florida, but that's Florida's down below. but Florida was not part of the original territory of the 13 colonies. So this map reflects the extent of the British Empire in the Americas. So they owned some territories down here, but we're focusing on what later became the United States. So it is amazing to see how much territory Britain owned in the United States. They also claimed all of Canada at some point. But again, the extent of the British Empire in territory that is now the United States is just extraordinary.